It's about gender, identity, and care that evolve in the ruins, and how storytelling helps us name what survives.
Reading helped me to imagine different worlds while also problem solving my own. So when we say it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world for who? The first act of violence the patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation. How do you begin to interpret a story like this? Here is a woman who desperately wanted to keep her husband's attention, so much so that she cut off her own ear to keep him. Like, what value system does this woman have that she feels like the only way to get what she wants is to harm herself?
Good afternoon, and welcome to WGSS's annual colloquium, where we are scheduled to have a spirited conversation today between Leah and Khaliah, Dr. Reed. I am Dr. Julia Jordan Zachary, the chair of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Wake Forest University. It is truly, truly my honor to be able to spend some time with you all today. My role is to sit back and learn, but in between sitting back and learning from these two amazing thinkers, I get to introduce Dr. Khaliah Reed. And Dr. Reed is professor of Black Feminist Digital Studies at Wake Forest. Dr. Reed started about a year and a half ago and has truly, truly been making a mark. Students are lined up to come see Dr. Reed. And I mention that because I think it's important for us to think about the work that goes into making this colloquium real, the thought process. I've watched Dr. Reed engage the text in the book and be overly excited in a good way about the types of questions that will be posed today. And this is what we're trying to do in WGSS, is to create a community of thinkers, both academics within what the academy considers academics, and our academics outside of the academy, such as Leah. So I welcome you to engage. You will have an opportunity to use the Q&A section to post questions. We want you to engage in today's colloquium. So at this point, I thank Dr. Reed, I thank Leah, and particularly I thank Sarah Goldstein for making this webinar possible. And I now have the honor of turning it over to Dr. Reed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Dr. Reed, and this year we're gathering around the department, annual research symposium and our theme of gender after the end of the world. Our symposium began with a question that feels both urgent and at times really unanswerable. What happens if it all just collapses? It's something I've been grappling with for the past year, is how we live in this moment defined by contradiction. We're all hyper connected, but also feel isolated and alone. There's progress and there's backlash, there's visibility and simultaneously erasure. The world feels like it's ending and rebooting at the same time, to use a computer analogy. This theme that we're using this year invites us to imagine what comes after the collapse, not just in an apocalyptic sense, even though we want to think through that too, but in the everyday reckonings that ask us to rebuild, reimagine, and remember what it means to live, to love, and to persist in the wake of an ending. It's about gender, identity, and care that evolve in the ruins, and how storytelling helps us name what survives. Our keynote speaker today, Leah Nicole Whitcomb, has built a body of work that speaks beautifully to this theme. In her collection, Apocalypse Still, she redefines what apocalypse means in many ways, not as just this catastrophic event that ends the world, but as an ongoing state of trying to live through it, and sometimes even turning a blind eye to it. Her stories center Black women and girls navigating both the fantastical but also the strangely and unfortunately familiar. So we have zombies, but also a parallel to pandemics, grief, survival, and at the center of it, sometimes community care. In her stories, apocalypse isn't just a single event, it's a condition. It's racial, environmental, intimate, and ongoing. Leah is a community storyteller from central Mississippi who writes about Black people, love, and magic. Her work blends the speculative imagination with the everyday textures of life that we all can grab onto and relate to. As we are going to talk about today, she is the author of Apocalypse Still, but also about the boy, a young adult romance exploring disability, grief, and friendship in contemporary times. Leah earned a BA from Millsaps College, where she studied media, cultural studies, and digital art, all things that hit at my heart. She co-hosts Hoodoo Plant Mamas, a Black spirituality podcast. Her work has been supported by the DeGroot Foundation, Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation, Barricade Writers, Women of Color Writers Podcast, and the Women's National Book Association. So she's been really busy. Her writing has been featured in Sis Stories, Samjoko Magazine, and the young adult anthology, All the Ways a Heart Burns. Through her fiction, she reminds us that storytelling is itself a survival strategy, that creativity, connection, and care are also world-building practices, even at the end of the world. Please join me in welcoming Leah Nicole Whitcomb.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Thank you, Dr. Julia Jordan-Zachary. And also thank you, Sarah Goldstein, for inviting me to this webinar. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today. When the Women, Gender, and Sexuality department first asked me to speak on gender at the end of the world, all I could think of was Oba. And so I was first introduced to Oba through tarot, particularly the Tarot of the Orisha, which is this deck right here. So I'm going to do some vocab work because I know Yoruba mythology isn't well known. So tarot is a system where you read the imagery on the cards to divine messages from spirits or God or the universe or whatever you believe in, right? Yoruba is an ethnic group in modern day Nigeria. They have their own culture, mythology, language that has been practiced for thousands of years. And there are a number of ethnic groups in Nigeria. Igbo is another one. And Orisha are Yoruba deities. And because of the transatlantic slave trade, Yoruba myths have gone where Yoruba people have gone. So Orisha can be found throughout the diaspora. We see Orisha in Cuba's Santeria and Brazil's Candomblé and many other countries. And so I have the Tarot of the Orishas, like I said, and in it, Oba looks like this. She is a pale-skinned woman in armor. She has a shield covering her face and a sword. She's wearing a headdress, and she is like tiptoeing on the rocks along the river. And so from this card, I don't get much, right? Oba has no comparatives in the Rider-Waite Tarot, which is the standard tarot deck. In that deck, Yemaya is the empress and Oshun is the high priestess. Obatala is the emperor. But for Oba, there are no comparatives, just as there are comparatives between Yoruba Orishas and Catholic saints like Obatala, Jesus Christ, Ogun, St. Peter. But for Oba, there is none. And so through tarot, I had to learn the tale of Oba to understand what this card means. And according to Yoruba myth, Oba was the first wife of Shango. But he had other wives. He had Oshun, he had Oya. And Oba loved her husband, but she was also afraid because he had other wives. She was afraid that she couldn't keep his love. So she consulted her sister wife, Oshun. There are some versions where she consulted Oya, but we'll say Oshun, on how to keep Shango's love and attention. And so Oshun told Oba to cut off one of her ears to prepare a soup for Shango, and then he will love her forever. So she did. She cut off her ear, she prepared the soup, and when Shango came home, Oba served it to him. But Shango was wondering, what is going on with my wife? Why is her head covered up? what's happening to her. And so Oba ignored her husband. She went about her chores. Shango was still distraught. Like, what is going on with my wife? Why is her head bandaged? And so he got up from the table. He found her cleaning. He removed the headdress. And then he saw her ear was missing. And he asked, "Who did this to you? Who attacked you?" And she was forced to tell the truth that she did it. She cut off her own ear because she wanted him to love her forever. And when Shango hears of this, he's angry. He's disgusted. He feels betrayed and he kicks Oba out, and she's left to wander along this river, the Oba River, in Africa. So imagine getting that in a tarot spread. Like, how do you begin to interpret a story like this? Here's a woman who desperately wanted to keep her husband's attention, so much so that she cut off her own ear to keep him. Like, what value system does this woman have that she feels like the only way to get what she wants is to harm herself? But as I sat with this story, I realized that it is not as far-fetched as I like it to be. So obviously, I love stories. I'm an author, right? I grew up in pre-social media, rural Mississippi, and I only had an antenna to connect me to the outside world. So stories were how I filled my time. They were how I colored my world, reading about a cozy bear family and the lessons they learned, or about a group of friends who wanted to be babysitters, right? A lot of us read stories like that. Reading helped me to imagine different worlds while also problem solving my own. And it's not just me. My mama, she owns a physical media collection of at least 1,000 movies and TV series. And there was one year in the 2010s when VCRs were starting to become obsolete that my daddy went on the hunt throughout town trying to find her one for her birthday because he knew how much her stories meant to her. And so in my wider family, there are a number of storytellers. I think often of my uncle, whose ability to like hook you into a story and then drag you along. And then he drops this ending that's like funny and resolute. It's really admirable. And I'm constantly thinking about how he uses humor to keep people engaged, how he listens to the audience as much as they listen to him. And I be taking notes so I can incorporate the same things into my own writing because stories surround us. And it's not just the stories that we have been taught, our stories like TV and movies and books, but it's also in people's cultural beliefs. Like for me, I can often tell where someone falls on the political spectrum based on what stories they were exposed to and which ones they choose to believe. And so one time I was at a Trump supporter's house. The person who is the reason I was there, I cussed them out and I no longer talk to this person because they put me in that situation. But when I was there, that man was talking about Black Lives Matter, and it was super fascinating to me because he said, as a white man, he had beat up many cops. And that blew my mind, like many cops. And because he lived to tell the tale, therefore, Black people were lying when they claimed they did nothing to be shot and killed. And so the story that this man believed was that all people in the United States were dealt the same hand. You know, everyone was treated equal. Everyone had the same punishments, the same consequences. That's what he believed. He believed Black people were just really bad players at this with the hand that they were dealt. And that's why we lost at everything. And so being a Black person with firsthand experience of being Black in America, I know that's not true. But this was the story this man held on to. And it was such a powerful story that it became one of his core beliefs. And he acted upon it when he went out into the world and voted, right? Which influences all of our lives. And so that's really why I'm in the storytelling game. Like it is some powerful, impactful work. But looking at stories in this way, I had to ask, where did I learn about gender? Where did I learn that it was a binary? Certain traits were expected of me. What cultural myths were surrounding my little rural community about womanhood? And the answer for a lot of this was the Bible. I grew up missionary Baptist in the Bible Belt. I've been baptized in the church. You know, I've read more of the Bible as a teenager than most people have in their lifetimes. I can still quote a lot of scriptures. I'm very familiar with the mythology. But there are two women in particular that if I talk about Oba, I have to talk about them, and they are Eve and Mary. So when we're introduced to the first woman, it's in the fall of man, Genesis chapter 3. And in that story, God punished Adam and Eve not because they sinned, but because they questioned his authority. And I think it's interesting that those two are conflated as being the same thing. And so often when we're told about Genesis chapter 3, as this lying, sneaking devil serpent who tricked Eve into eating an apple, and that caused the fall of man. So I really want to read Genesis chapter 3, verse 1 through 7, so that way we can all together read it and understand what actually happened. So the New International Version starts as, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden. But God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will not certainly die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." One thing I've always found very interesting about this passage is the language used. Like the first line, it talks about the serpent being crafty. And after this, in verse 13, Eve says, "The serpent deceived me," crafty and deceptive. But when we go back to what the serpent said, he said, "You will not die if you eat from the tree. God knows that you will be like him, knowing good and evil." And then what happened? Adam and Eve did not die. Their eyes opened. They gained knowledge that they were naked. And so, in that context, who was the liar and who was deceptive? And at the end of chapter 3, verse 22 reads, "And the Lord God said, the man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil," just like the serpent said. "He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. And so to recap, right, after punishing Adam and Eve for disobeying God and questioning his authority, he said they knew too much, and if they eat from the tree of life, there will be no difference between them and us. And so some scholars consider the us to be multiple gods, or like a polytheistic expression of God, like Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But growing up, I was told over and over again that the reason we suffer is because of Eve. Because Eve didn't listen, that's why women are punished. And it was when I revisited the story in a religious studies class in college that I realized that that is a very convenient narrative for patriarchal capitalism. It reinforces the idea that disobeying authority figures justifies the punishment that comes to you. It's not that the fall of man happened because Eve was deceived by the serpent and forced her husband to disobey God. No. The fall of man happened because Adam and Eve did not blindly submit to the will of God, and God knew that the only thing separating Adam and Eve from him was another fruit. We can even read the protecting of the tree of life as protecting capital, and he challenged that. Therefore, Eve was a problem. And then we compare Eve to Mary, a teenage girl who willingly gave her virgin body over to this male deity for his personal use. She did not question him. Despite the physical and social ramifications for her, she let his will play out on her body. She ceded her autonomy. And for that, she's held as our great mother. She is the virgin mother. She's the woman that all women should aspire to be. So that is my basis for womanhood. Challenging authority, figuring the truth out for yourself is bad. It is the reason that all humans suffer. Letting God impregnate you when you really don't want to be pregnant is good, you know? Autonomy is bad. Obedience and subservience are good. And so now thinking of Eve and Mary, I want to get back to Oba, because I think a capitalist country would love a woman like Oba who willingly cut off her own ear to keep a man. Like that level of self-sacrifice is giving Mary. It's important to note that the tale of Oba's ear that I shared earlier is shunned by her devotees. So Orisha devotees are people who elevate and honor the names, stories, and land associated with the Orisha. And so Oba's devotees don't want this story associated with her memory. They find it shameful. It is not their Orisha. And so within a traditional West African context, this is not just a story about a desperate, jealous wife. It's a woman who does not love or respect herself. And her lack of self-love is a betrayal to her husband, Shango. He does not view self-mutilation as a sign of devotion. I think in the West it would be. But Shango rightfully points out that it's manipulation. And so in Bell Hooks's popular book, All About Love, she wrote, if patriarchal masculinity estranges men from their selfhood, it is equally true that women who embrace patriarchal femininity, the insistence that females should act as though they are weak, incapable of rational thought, dumb, silly, are also socialized to wear a mask, to lie. This is one of the primary themes in Lerner's The Dance of Deception. With shrewd insight, she calls women to account for our participation in structures of pretense and lies, particularly within family life. Women are often comfortable lying to men in order to manipulate them to give us things we feel we want or deserve. And so manipulation is seen as a very American or Western view of womanhood. Within the traditional West African context, Shango views Oba's acts as both a betrayal of herself and a betrayal of her marriage. And so what I think is interesting when a community rejects this story in particular, it's not only a rejection of a woman's role in a relationship. Like, this is not the way a wife is supposed to act. It's also a rejection of a gender expectation. This is not the way a woman is supposed to act. And it's a rejection of a self. This is not the way a person is supposed to act. Why would you mutilate yourself for somebody else? And so when I was younger, I used to ask, why does it seem like gender always prioritizes one group over the rest of us? But now that I'm older, I know that gender punishes all of us. Like, we're all punished under these narrow constraints of gender. And so going back to Bell Hooks in The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love, she wrote, the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. And that's what gender is, like self-mutilation for everybody. Gender requires that we all cut off our ears in order to fit into society, to fit into rigid definitions of who the self should be. But if you can willingly cut off a part of yourself to serve an agenda, you can easily be manipulated and controlled. Again, going back to even Mary, which woman is condemned and which is praised based on their willingness to submit to a male authority figure? Who does that benefit in the end? And so since this symposium is about gender at the end of the world, I do want to talk about the end of the world, right? When I hear people talk about this is the end of times, this is the end of the world, I can't help but to think of my ancestors who were born enslaved and who died enslaved. My ancestors further back who were forced to leave their families, voyage in the belly of a ship across the Atlantic, and start over in a place where they didn't know the people and the land and the language. I think about the indigenous populations of America, the diseases that were said to have spread before the Europeans did. So imagine your whole tribe fighting an illness that came out of nowhere, you surviving mass disease and death, only to witness an army of white men who are ready to kill you while you're down, right? It's estimated that up to 95% of the indigenous populations in America are extinct, like gone, whole cultures, languages, and people wiped from the face of the earth. So when we say it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world for who, right? I'm also of the firm belief that an ending is not the end. And there are multiple endings going on right now, right? It's the fall of the United States. That's uncomfy for a lot of people. This is our first fall of an empire. So a lot of us turn to stories to soothe us. And in 2020, what felt like the end of the world for many of us, I would scroll on my phone. I would see Black people dying from COVID and then Black people dying from police violence. And it just felt like Black death was inescapable. It suffocated me. It infiltrated my dreams with scenes of lynching and racial terror and violence. And so I wrote about it in Apocalypse Still. Using speculative fiction elements, I was able to imagine worlds counter to the contemporary narrative, worlds where racism was defeated with magic, where aliens controlled the government, where zombies ran rampant, and my ancestors had a fighting chance, worlds where I could warn and educate and inspire. And for me, speculative fiction allows us to look at the world from a distance, to blow up the mundane into this extraordinary event that forces us to pay attention to what we've become numb to. And in that way, speculative fiction helps us to better understand our current reality. And to me, there's no speculative fiction more popular than the Book of Revelations. So, according to American biblical scholar L. Michael White, apocalyptic literature was common among the ancients in Rome. He wrote, apocalyptic literature was almost always a kind of literature for insiders. That is to say, it was written for people who already knew something of the situation and of the symbols that were used to portray it. So for the original audience of the Revelation of John, all these strange scenes would have been immediately intelligible. And this is what makes Revelations kind of hard. You combine the fact that it's a book filled with literary metaphors, historical insider knowledge, and a bunch of Americans who are functionally illiterate, and you get a lot of bad faith interpretations. You get Rapture Talk 2025, which is a bunch of people who read the book of Revelations and panicked about all these things coming to fruition. But the book of Revelations is apocalyptic literature. It's speculative fiction meant to air out the grievances for the way the Roman administration treated Christians. Like most classic literature, we can receive universal truths from reading the book of Revelations, but it's not meant to be taken seriously. It's like someone 2,000 years from now reading the titular story in my collection, Apocalypse Still, and thinking that we all had to continue working while zombies ran rampant outside. So in Apocalypse Still, a woman is forced back into the office, even though she's previously been bitten by a zombie, and she hasn't turned. So obviously everything's okay. And so it goes through her day and how her coworkers repeat, everything's back to normal. The zombies aren't even that big of a deal, right? And so for modern audiences, we know what I'm signing to because we've been there and we have that contemporary insider knowledge, but 2,000 years from now, they won't. And so it's important to remember that like Revelations, apocalypse, all these words mean is uncover. What is being uncovered right now that has previously been hidden from us? What is the truth that is being laid bare that's impossible to escape from? That's the true revelation to me. That's the true apocalypse. So thinking of gender at the end of the world, I go back to Oba, right? But I think of Oba in reverse. So in tarot, cards can be read upright or reversed. Some people view reversals as a shadow side of the card. They view it as more intense or chaotic or negative. In the companion guide to this tarot collection, it has Oba upright as a loving, passionate woman and reversed as a jealous, self-destructive woman, but I don't see her in that way. So the companion guide tries to make the upright version the good aspects of her and the reverse version the bad aspects. But she's a woman who cut off her own ear for love. Like she did that. And instead of making it seem like that's something separate from her, we need to acknowledge that that's part of her value system. Upright, I view her as a woman a little too attached to a goal, someone who's willing to get what she wants to the detriment of herself, who's willing to split herself open as an offering for love and acceptance. To me, she's a cautionary tale. But reversed, I view her as a rejection of those ideas. She's a woman who can abandon a goal if it means maintaining her respect and integrity. She's a passionate woman, but not to her own detriment. She aligns more closely with the Oba, the devotees elevate, the of regal, dignified woman with power and authority. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing right now with the end of gender politics. A lot of women are rejecting the story that if you're a good woman like Mary, you'll be rewarded with Prince Charming, you'll get married, you'll live happily ever after, kids, family, right? You'll be fulfilled. But women today are rightfully pointing out and rejecting the double share of labor under patriarchy and capitalism, which requires self-sacrifice and mutilation by being stay-at-home wives and mothers, which are thankless jobs in our society. Women are requiring more of the men who've coasted for the past few centuries. More young women are delaying or avoiding marriage and children altogether. And as a result, it's triggered the male loneliness epidemic, and that the men today were not raised to be equal partners to the women of today. And they're being left behind because of their refusal to adapt. And so we see the struggle now with the push of trad wives and the return of thinness and the forced removal of women from the workplace since 2020, erasing queer and trans people from the narrative, the fight to keep things the way they always were, that fight, that push and pull is creating all of this tension that we see between people who want to delay the ending of this world and people who want to usher in the next one. And I just kind of want to reassure you that this is all normal, like the bickering and tension, anxiety. It was all in Revelations. Like, it's the end of the world, right? But that was 2,000 years ago, and we're still here. And we already have the tools we need to build the world that we want. So in Ghana, the Akan people have an Adinkra symbol called Sankofa. It comes from the Twi expression, which means go back and get it. It's often a sign that there are lessons from the past that we need to glean info from as we go into the future. And so I think for a lot of us, we make the mistake of thinking the future needs to be different, shiny, new. But what if we already have the technology needed for a better world, right? What if it's buried under colonialism? So Gambian writer Lavette Jalot noted for millennia, African languages were gender neutral until colonialism forced a binary on it. She writes, the colonial imposition of gender roles severely disrupted African societies, where identities were shaped by roles within the community, not by strict definitions of male and female. African languages that didn't have gendered pronouns were branded as backward, and African cultures were told to conform to the binary logic of Western thought. Today, that colonial mindset still impacts the way we perceive gender and language. So, African societies, gender was shaped by roles within the community, not by strict definitions of male and female. So imagine a world where what you have to contribute to community isn't limited by the equipment that you were born with. There are people who have lived that way and who are currently living that way, showing us that another way of life is possible. And so I love reminding people that the United States only makes up 4% of the global population. Like, the way we do gender is not the only way, and it's not the right way. There are other ways of living. There are people who are currently working to disrupt the binary that is imposed on us. And so to think about apocalypse and uncovering the truth about the stories we've been told about gender, who told you what a woman looked like? What being a man required? Who told you that there were only two genders you could be? And how are you still holding on to these stories? Like, I believe all media is propaganda in that political messaging that spreads influential ideas to support or harm an institution, demographic, or person through mass media. I'm not saying propaganda is right or wrong, but it can color how we can interpret an event, like the story of Eve. We've been told she's a weak sinner who's susceptible to temptation. She's the reason for all of us suffering. It creates a society that believes suffering is okay. But another interpretation is that Eve is curious enough to challenge authority, and she enlightens others to do the same. It's the same story, but it shifts depending on who tells it and the agenda behind it. So it's important to think about the stories that we've been told and what's been done with those stories. Are they stories meant to build us up or to break us down? Have the stories been used to manipulate us to act outside of ourselves? Are they urging us to self-mutilate for acceptance? What are the stories you have been told about who you are and who you can be? And how can you create a story that feels like a truer interpretation of events, one that honors the story and yourself? And so I think we need to ask these big questions. We need to do this deep investigative work of questioning media narratives and cultural myths and the stories we've been spoon-fed, because many of us hold them as precious. They become a part of us. They comfort us. But we also have to question that comfort, because Are we becoming comfortable with stories that tell us to harm ourselves or to help ourselves? And that is very uncomfortable work that we have to do. And that is the truth that is being uncovered at the end of times. Like, what part of your gender identity is innate? And what is a performance that requires self sacrifice? Are you aware that there's a difference between the two? And the reason we have to do this deep investigative work is that, as I said, we're witnessing the ending of the United States, the ending of the society we've always known, whether we want to or not. An ending births a new beginning. And so a new society will be created. What stories do we want in this new world? What lives are we imagining for ourselves, for our children, for our future generation? And as the creators of the new world, what stories are we choosing to cross over with us?
Thank you so much. That was such a
Yes.
great talk. I love how you really charted out storytelling, not just in the contemporary, but the historical. And that's one of the things I really love about your collection, that we get so many different stories. You mentioned there at the end that of where are we getting our stories from and what stories are we holding on to? And that's one of the things that we're kind of trying to investigate with this symposium, that when the rubble clears, what stories are we holding on to and finding comfort in? What is persisting? And I love how you mentioned like your own definitions of womanhood were informed by these various different stories of Mary, of Eve, but also just the idea of how we're getting stories not only from religion, but African spirituality, and even at times TikTok when it wants to front as like this spiritual app. And that, I guess, would be my first question for you. How much of all of these different avenues of understanding the world and viewing yourself informed your choice to do a collection of stories rather than a single narrative? What was that, an intentional choice that I'm going to tell the story of multiple women rather than just one?
Yeah, so when I think the first story I wrote for this collection was Entangled. And at the end of Entangled, the main character, Shauna, she calls on her ancestors to help her in this, I'll say it's a lynching. So she calls on them to help like save her essentially. And so I was curious about the women that she's calling on. What is their story throughout time and what is their relationship to this violence that she's experiencing? And so for me, it was thinking about like how things have changed for Black women in the United States, but not really. Like we're still dealing with the same sort of monsters, but it's dressed up differently. Like Lucy, who is one of Shauna's ancestors, Lucy was from the 1820s, still dealing with white supremacy, still dealing with white men wanting to harm her, wanting to do whatever they wanted to with her body. And so her descendant, Shauna, is still dealing with the same things. And so I was thinking about that through line of what are the ways that Black women are still dealing with the same issues and how are they combating them throughout time.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what was interesting about this collection was some stories felt very contemporary, with the like, we got to wear turtlenecks to cover up our bite marks, very COVID-esque. But then other stories like Entangled or even Runaway felt very historical at times, or at least in my mind, with the previous narratives we've had of, lynchings and slavery. It brings you back to a time that's not current. Did you find it challenging balancing, that through line and going from what the reader might signal as very much not my time to, oh, this just happened a few years ago?
Mm, that's a good question. I think for me, when I was thinking about the ordering of these stories, I was thinking about like what would make logical sense. I was thinking about the meaning of the story. I was also thinking about the time. So I know all of these stories take place within the same universe. And then chronologically, I think the first story is like 1820, and then the last story is like not 19, like 2060. So it's a bit in the past and then a bit in the future. And so I was imagining all of this, but then I was also trying to hint to the reader that we're building on previous stories. So I had to think about what did I reference first, and then how can I reference that in a later story, while also trying to make each story feel like its own, right? So I was trying to connect them, but then also kind of preserve that bit of individuality and kind of show a glimpse of each of the events that I wanted to cover in this collection.
Yeah, I guess I keep coming back to this because it's such a present like through line of, the stories of Black women and how things change, 2060, but they have such resonance with the stories of our ancestors, of our foremothers. And it reminds me of how you talked about, listening to your family members and, jotting down their stories just to get like the texture of how people talk. And that reminds me of, I think it was with Bell Hooks, I think that mentioned, like sitting under the table and listening to all the women talk in the kitchen, or August Wilson going to a bar in Philly and just like listening to people talk. And my question for you is, there is a bit of weight that comes with carrying those stories, particularly the ones that you are trying to detail even in a speculative form. Is there a sort of like self-care that has to go into not only carrying the stories of not only yourself, your contemporaries, but your ancestors, the ones that, can rise up from the roots like an entangled when you're in danger, or have nowhere to turn? Is there like a self-care work that goes into that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I was writing about really traumatic things. And I think on the one hand, like I Entangle started as a dream where I was with a friend and that friend tricked me and I ended up being hunted down by like a clan. And so it was terrifying to me and I just could not sleep. So I had to go and I had to write that story in order to feel safe again to be able to sleep. So on the one hand, a lot of writing these stories was cathartic for me. It helped me to get over a lot of like fears and anxieties that I had around racial violence. And then on the other hand, it was very hard to try to like sit and imagine what certain things were. So with Lucy, I really wanted Lucy in Runaway, I really wanted to think about what did slavery feel like in the body. And all I could envision was like trembling hands, right? And then I had to sit with like, what would her day-to-day life be like? And that was really heavy stuff to be like, what was the everyday life of my actual ancestor who had to experience this? And that was very difficult for me. I think for me, this collection is, I think 10 stories. It took about 13 months to write because I would only do a story a month because it was a lot. So I couldn't just like write. So that was also part of it too. It was like writing the story, letting it sit, like taking care of myself, coming back to it, and then also bringing in, I was workshopped all of these stories as well. So bringing in my workshop group to also help me process it as I'm going through these.
You mentioned, the everyday of your ancestors. And what was fascinating to me was so many of these stories. I mean, it could maybe perhaps not the first one, but the rest of them, they start off so every day. It's like, oh, I'm going to work, I'm doing this, I'm helping. It seems like, what I read is like a almost parallel to like a slave master's wife, like helping her with her hair. So it seemed very grounded. And then you throw in something like blood attraction or, covering a bite mark. And I thought that was particularly a fun aspect of reading this, of like, okay, when is she going to introduce the speculative part of this? Was there some intention about when you chose to introduce those elements? And did you want it to have a specific effect on the reader when you chose to insert those elements?
I think for me, I just kind of chose it organically, but then that was something that came up in when I was workshopping a lot of these were like maybe signaling early on that this will be more of a speculative story. I think because it's a collection, I can get away with having something a little bit more mundane in the beginning and then building on it to make it more speculative. But yeah, that was definitely commentary that I got a lot, was that maybe I need to add more hints to the reader that this will take a more speculative turn. Because for me, I was just going with what I felt was best for how I wanted to tell the story.
Well, I mean, as a reader, a critique group is meant to, push you to produce
Yeah.
your best work. But as a reader, I found it very interesting. I'm reading and then it's like, wait, what? Like, what are we talking? Are they like, the story where, they were of a particular species, the Dara,
The different.
yeah, and it just seems like, a boy meets girl type of story, and then we're mentioning, oh, I don't think they're humans, or oh, what are we talking about being attracted to? Like, I thought as a reader that that was actually a particularly compelling part of this. All right, I know this is supposed to be speculative. Okay, when is the speculative coming into this? And there were a few stories, like, the Kiana story, the one where she's into like race play.
Race play. Yeah.
And as reading that, I was getting parallels to other writers, and I'm curious: do you have, other writers that you look to just overall in your writing journey and deciding what type of storyteller you want to be, even if it's like, um, your mom who, is detailing what happened at work, like, or were there storytellers in your life that really inform the way you tell stories?
I would say yes. So I'm going to talk about race play because you brought that up. I wrote that very quickly after reading Kindred by Octavia Butler because I was so curious about the relationship between Rufus and Dana. And there was like, he's her ancestor, but there was also this weird like sexual tension there. And I was like, what is going on there? And so me writing race play was me kind of answering a lot of the questions that I had left after reading that. So that was definitely Octavia Butler inspired with that piece. But in terms of where I have learned to kind of develop my storytelling skills, I think often of Kiese Lehman, who is a Black Mississippi writer. And back when I was in college, we went to the same college. So back when I was in college,
He wrote
he would
heavy.
visit sometimes. So
Yeah, yeah, I know exactly who you're talking
so
about.
back when I was in college, he would visit. And so something he said very early on in like my writing career was like, don't write to white people. And then he also talked about his audience and how he writes to the front row of his audience, which is his mama and his grandma and like little Black children in Mississippi. And so it really reshaped like what stories I'm telling and who am I telling to. And so for me, that really pushed me, especially throughout the past decade as I've been working on like craft and stuff. It really pushed me to be like, okay, who am I telling this story about and who am I telling it to? And what is the language that they would understand? And how can I make sure that I'm telling a story that is, I guess, impactful or influential to them? I think I did have a critique in Entangled. And so my writing group, they were non-Black. And one thing that they talked about was like how the Black main character needed to suffer more. And I was like, I don't agree with that. And so I have Black women writer friends, and I asked them, I was like, what do you think I should do with it? And they were like, it is a very intense, heavy story. And so I noticed that Black people and non-Black people, when they would read this collection, they would have different experiences. And it would be a lot more intense for Black people. And I was like, because they are my target audience, I'm going to take their opinion first. If they're like, this story is already very intense, I'm not going to take the opinion that a character needs to suffer more in order to earn a redemptive ending. Like, I'm going to take care of the people that I'm trying to write to.
I have a follow-up to that, but in the meantime, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll read them out. So while we're waiting for those to populate, Entangled was an intense story. And I think for me, what was interesting was almost that feeling of am I being paranoid? Am I overreading what's happening here? I think his friend's name was Mark, maybe. And it's like, he hates me, and everyone around you is saying, no, oh, sorry, you're reading too far into it. And I think there is something to be said, like when you asked, how are we defining apocalypse? And for some people, now is really apocalyptic. I think the same thing can be said about fear of what might seem as, mundane. For some people, it's already terrifying, and you're already existing in the, maybe I am paranoid, but what if I'm not? What if I brush this off and I'm wrong? And I think so that's very interesting. You brought up that critique of this needs to be more terrifying, because there was fear in the details, I'll say. Did you have a similar reckoning with any other stories of, this is my front row, and even though I'm getting this feedback, this is who I'm writing to, and I think they will understand it?
Yes, I would say the last story in there is The Town of Los Valles. It is not a speculative fiction story, but for me, I felt like that was a story that was necessary. So it's about class solidarity, particularly between this Black family and this Hispanic community. And so for me, like that just felt like a breath of fresh air after having written that whole collection. And so I really wanted to end on that. And I also like the ending of it of like, I'll see you later. Because that was also me as a writer being like, I got more work coming. So I'll see you in the next one. So for me, I really love that story. I really love what it represents because it was very hope. It was like, despite all of the bad things that this Black family went through, there's still hope, there's still community, there's still love. And that's really what I wanted to end on. And again, my writing group was like, this just doesn't feel as strong as your other pieces. And I was like, I don't care. I've needed something light and something that was hopeful to end on. So that was really important for me.
And I really liked how the collection wrapped up. I didn't even think to like connect it to, this is how you as the writer are sort of like breaking the fourth wall in a way. But as I was reading through most of the stories, and this kind of guided my first question of like, why a short story collection and not, one through narrative, I got so connected to certain characters. And then we're like moving on to the next one of, like when we think about Keanu and race play, that is, it's so rich with like detailed and ideas around, finding pleasure in something that's historically rooted in pain, or, in Apocalypse Still, of feeling her neck and realizing she doesn't have a heartbeat. And then we're on to the next one. So I feel like the whole collection is like a, please answer the phone and talk more. Please, 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 can we have some more? So it's interesting you kind of like wrapped it in that way. And I guess this will be my last question to kind of like wrap it up. What do you hope readers that are coming to this book and they're closing the last page, what do you hope they take away from it? Not only about Apocalypse, but about you as a writer as well.
For me, when I think of apocalypse, and the reason I named it Apocalypse Still is that I really wanted to complicate this idea that now is the worst time to ever be here, and think about our ancestors, particularly the ancestors in the United States, both African and indigenous, and think about their lives. I'm like, was that not apocalypse for them? And also, there are pieces that I have said in the future that I'm like, there will probably still be white supremacy, right? That it's probably something we still will have to deal with. Is that not still apocalyptic? And so I kind of wanted to complicate that idea that only now is the most terrible time ever, and that there's nothing else here. I also wanted there to be a level of warmth because there are some very like dark and scary things in this collection, but I also wanted you to have a little warmth, have there be community, have there be hope. And that was very important for me to end on hope. So I hope as a writer, what people take away from me is just that I don't know, I'm someone that cares about the world and I do think that we have a future. I'm not very pessimistic, like this is the end. I hope that people leave with a little bit of optimism and a little bit of there's work that needs to be done, and we are perfectly capable of doing that.
Well, thank you so very much. I know Dr. Jordan Dacre wants to come back on and kind of like wrap things up, but this was such anything I imagined, it was not how it played out. It was so much better than I could have imagined.
I was sitting here thinking we could have at least another hour of this lovely conversation between you, Leah Nicole Whitcomb, and Dr. Khaliah Reed. I hate to be the one to say, oh, time is up. And I kept looking at the clock because I was truly mesmerized by the back and forth between you two, and starting out with that story of, Adam and Eve and Mary and the juxtaposition, and then weaving that tale around indigenous peoples and how do we imagine the world ending and who is conforming and who is not. I mean, the layers upon layer upon layer you pulled us in with and asked us to grapple with as it relates to gender and sexuality and belonging and citizenship and an understanding of the world, and your use of personal narrative was just, amazing. I can see why you were such a brilliant storyteller.
Thank you.
I'm like, oh, that's a tale. Oh, I didn't think about that. And so, on that note, I want to say thank you, Leah, and thank you, Khaliah. Thank you, Khaliah, for those were some tough questions. And I sat back and I'm like, ooh, Khaliah is not playing.
And it was like it's all inspired by the book. Honestly, I think that just goes to what your book brought out of me. Like we got a piece of that today of storytelling in action, and getting that in the book. I was just like talking to my phone. That's how a lot of my questions came out. Like just phone notes app, just talking to them. So it wasn't like a meant to trick you up or anything, but just a testament to what your stories brought out of me.
Yes, and indeed, they do bring out a lot. And so we thank you, Leah, for sharing your gift of storytelling with us. We look forward to all the other books that we will be collecting. Keep us informed so that we could celebrate with you. And Clea, thank you again for being such a wonderful host and guiding this conversation. And once again, thank you, Sarah, for organizing. And thank you to our attendees for holding in there for an hour for this very rich discussion. I hope that something tugs at your heartstrings and you go on to write your story about your imagination of the end of the world. WGSS, thank you all for your participation.
It's about gender, identity, and care that evolve in the ruins, and how storytelling helps us name what survives.
Reading helped me to imagine different worlds while also problem solving my own. So when we say it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world for who? The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation. How do you begin to interpret a story like this? Here is a woman who desperately wanted to keep her husband's attention, so much so that she cut off her own ear to keep him. Like, what value system does this woman have that she feels like the only way to get what she wants is to harm herself?